Hi there, welcome back to St. Thomas Aquinas for Everyone. I'm Dave Palmer. We're going through the Cardinal Virtues now. We've already done prudence and we have done fortitude, and now it's time for the third of the four Cardinal Virtues, and this is going to be temperance. And it's probably something you've heard of before because we talk about being temperate in our appetites or our sleep or sexual desires and that kind of thing. So it's a word that's pretty common in the everyday use, but what exactly does it mean as tied in to the big picture of St. Thomas Aquinas? Of course, our end being to get to heaven, and how does this help us, the Cardinal Virtues, each of them, achieve our final end, which is knowledge of God, and of course, that which we know, which is good, we will love, and so love of God as well. So there's quite a few articles in this one. This one will go a little bit longer. I challenge you to stick with me for the whole thing, probably 15 minutes or so. But there's a lot of very practical information in this. Sometimes people think of Thomas as being so abstract and so deep, but we're talking about fasting and drunkenness and fornication in this. All-you-can-eat buffets have to do with temperance, and so it is very applicable to our everyday life. All right, so Thomas asks, look at this. We're in Secunda Secundae. Question 141. There's a lot of the Summa that we're skipping because we have to, because if we did every article of the Summa, this would take literally probably 10 years to do this, what we're doing, but I'm trying to do the whole Summa in a year, and we're on track to do that. So question 141, Article 3 says whether temperance is only about desires and pleasures. Of course, when we think of temperance, we often think of having maybe one banana split or splitting it with a friend, rather than eating the whole thing or eating two, which would be pretty intemperate, right? Pizza, that's something that I struggle with. The pizza goes down, and probably an average adult should maybe have about 3 pieces, and I could easily wolf down 4, 5, 6 pieces. And so it takes temperance to control our appetites, and then sleep, and of course sexual desires as well. But I don't like to put pictures up there because that's can be like pornographic. But anyway, you get the idea. Temperance has to do with all of our carnal desires. And so Thomas says it belongs to a moral virtue to safeguard the good of reason against the passions that rebel against reason. Now, the movement of the soul's passions is twofold: one whereby the sensitive appetite pursues sensible and bodily goods, food, drink, sleep, sex; the other whereby it flies from sensible and bodily evils. Now, if you want to think about sensible goods, just think about what you have in common with your dog. I mean, basically, as far as wanting to eat, wanting to have drink, wanting to sleep, wanting, sexual appetites, that kind of thing. So these are low on the scale as opposed to that which has to do with the will or prudence and intellectual virtue, right? The first of these movements of the sensitive appetite rebels against reason chiefly by lack of moderation, because sensible and bodily goods considered in their species are not in opposition to reason, but are subject to it as instruments which reason employs in order to attain its proper end. All right, all these things I'm talking about, sleep and sex and food and drink, and they're all good, right? But in moderation. Remember, virtue is in the mean, and they are opposed to reason is owing to the fact that the sensitive appetite fails to tend toward them in accord with the mode of reason. Hence, it belongs properly to moral virtue to moderate those passions that denote a pursuit of the good. On the other hand, the movement of the sensitive appetite in flying from sensible evil is mostly in opposition to reason, not through being immoderate, but chiefly in respect of its flight, because when a man flies from sensible and bodily evils, which sometimes accompany the good of reason, the result is that he flies from the good of reason. Hence, it belongs to moral virtue to make man, while flying from evil, to remain firm in the good of reason. Okay, now, think about this. If you walk in the kitchen and you see a cockroach on the floor, right? A moderate response is, I need to get this cockroach out of my kitchen, right? Or set a trap or whatever you want to do to get out of the kitchen. I tend to try to keep the bugs alive and try to catch it and throw it out the door. But anyway, sometimes you got to kill them. All right, so on the other hand, let me ask you this. If you saw this snake, what would you do? Would you freak out? Would you kill it? Would you run? What would you do? And what about if you saw this one? The point being is that one of these snakes is venomous and one is not venomous. One of them you could pick up and hold and have as a pet and be no problem at all, right? One of them, if it bit you, you might die, right? So the point is that we don't know this naturally, but we have an obligation to, learn and use our reason, right? I wouldn't probably kill either of these. One of them I wouldn't touch, but one of them I would. Venomous coral snake, okay? And then this one is a harmless scarlet king snake. They look similar, but they're very different. And of course, this is an example of using reason and not freaking or just, killing every creature we see because out of our ignorance. You can tell I'm a snake lover, can't you? I love snakes. All right, whether fasting is an act of virtue. Okay, so hopefully you do fast every now and then. I try to do bread and water fasts at least once or twice a week. It's very good, I think, not only for the soul but also for the body. Thomas says an act is virtuous through being directed by reason to some virtuous good. Now this is consistent with fasting because fasting is practiced for a threefold purpose. First, in order to bridle the lusts of the flesh, whereby the Apostle Paul says in fasting and chastity, that is to say, lust is cooled by abstinence in meat and drink. So if you can learn to control your appetite for food and drink, you're probably more likely to control other appetites that you have because your reason is in command of your passions and not vice versa. Secondly, we have recourse to fasting in order that the mind may rise more freely to the contemplation of heavenly things. Hence it is related of Daniel that he received a revelation from God after fasting for 3 weeks. Can you imagine? Some people do that. Some people, for health reasons, will not eat for 3 weeks. Thirdly, in order to satisfy, I don't know that everybody should do that. Consult your doctor. Okay, don't. I'm not a doctor. Thirdly, in order to satisfy for sin, whereby it is written, "Be converted to me with all your heart," and fasting and weeping and mourning. The same is declared by Augustine in a sermon. Fasting cleanses the soul, raises the mind, subjects one's flesh to the spirit, renders the heart contrite and humble, scatters the clouds of concupiscence, quenches the fire of lust, kindles the true light of chastity. And that's coming from a guy that knew, because of course if you know about Augustine, he had to battle a lot of those demons himself in his own life with unchastity. Okay, gluttony. I think gluttony is one of the least talked about sins in the culture. All right, you ever see these hot dog eating contests? And I don't know, I think it's kind of weird when people sit there and eat 60, 70 hot dogs. I think it's it's gluttony on display, isn't it? I mean, and then the all-you-can-eat places, I think in and of themselves, they're okay. I think there's certainly a temptation to gluttony because who should eat all they can eat? I mean, we should eat enough to satisfy ourselves, right, at a meal, but all you can eat, isn't that gluttony by its very, very name? But again, not being overly judgmental here. The vice of gluttony properly consists in inordinate concupiscence. Now, the order of reason in regulating the concupiscence may be considered from 2 points of view. First, with regard to things directed to the end, as much as they may be incommensurate and consequently disproportionate to the end. Secondly, with regard to the end itself, inasmuch as concupiscence turns man away from his due end. Accordingly, if the inordinate concupiscence and gluttony be found to turn man away from his last end, gluttony will be a mortal sin. This is the case when he adheres to the pleasures of gluttony as his end, for the sake of which he contemns God, being ready to disobey God's commandments in order to obtain these pleasures. On the other hand, if the inordinate concupiscence in the vice of gluttony be found to affect only such things as are directed to the end, for instance, when a man has too great a desire for the pleasure of the palate, yet would not, for their sake, do anything contrary to God's law, it is venial. Now, a couple of quick observations about this. This, I think, means that, that hot dog eating contest, even though I think it's kind of weird, I don't particularly like them. If somebody's not doing this because it's their end and they still love God, and I don't know, maybe they are trying to win a prize to feed their family or what have you, then I think Thomas is saying it's not a mortal sin. All you can eat buffets are not mortal sins. Some people go in there and eat very moderately. But Thomas is saying sometimes it's mortal, sometimes it's not. Also, interestingly, Thomas was a big guy. Thomas, I don't know if he was overweight as in fat or just a big guy. So this probably was very personal to him. And you can see how he kind of, qualified when exactly it's a mortal sin. Drunkenness, is it a mortal sin? And you probably realize that, yes, drunkenness is a mortal sin, but do you know why it's a mortal sin? The sin of drunkenness consists in the immoderate use of concupiscence of wine and beer, of course, or hard liquor. It may happen that a man is well aware that the drink is immoderate and intoxicating, and yet he would rather be drunk than abstain from drink. Of course, that happens all the time. Such a man is a drunkard, properly speaking, because morals take the species not from things that occur accidentally and besides the intention, but from that which is directly intended. In this way, drunkenness is a mortal sin, because when a man is willingly and knowingly deprives himself of the use of reason, whereby he performs virtuous deeds and avoids sin, and thus he sins mortally by running the risk of falling into sin. Right? So what defines us, what makes a difference between us and our pet goldfish or hamster or dog, is that we are rational. This is a great gift. Okay, it also means that we can come to know God. And to purposely do away with reason or to diminish it is a sin, all right? And as Thomas says, it also leads us into other sins. For Ambrose says, so we learn that we should shun drunkenness, which prevents us from avoiding grievous sins. For the things we avoid when sober, we unknowingly commit through drunkenness. Therefore, drunkenness, properly speaking, is a mortal sin. And I think a lot of people sometimes, and believe me, I've been there. I'm not casting aspersions. I've been there. Get drunk so that they can diminish their reason, so that they can have an excuse to do other things, right? Simple fornication, is it a mortal sin? Now, you're going to find it interesting because, of course, again, you're probably going to say, yeah, of course, Thomas is going to say that premarital sex is a mortal sin, but why is it a mortal sin? This is not something that's typically talked about too much. Without any doubt, we must hold simple fornication to be a mortal sin. In order to make this evident, we must take note that every sin committed directly against human life is a mortal sin. Now, simple fornication implies an inordinateness that tends to injure the life of the offspring to be born in this union. For we find in all animals where the upbringing of the offspring needs care of both male and female. Now, it is evident that the upbringing of the human child requires not only the mother's care for his nourishment, but much more the care of the father as guard and guardian, under whom he progresses in goods both internal and external. Hence, human nature rebels against an indeterminate union of the sexes and demands that a man should be united to a determinate woman and should abide with her as a long time or even a whole lifetime. Okay, so as long as they're married. So Thomas is saying fornication is wrong because of the harm it does to the offspring. Isn't that great? And that the importance of a man and a woman raising a child. I know sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes a father dies or a mother dies, right? Or there's a horrible situation where the one spouse has to leave the other one. But anyways, anger. Okay, is anger a sin? Okay, she looks very angry. He looks very angry. But so did Jesus. Jesus got angry as well in the temple, right? Turning over the tables and the money changers and all that. So that would lead you to believe that anger is not always a sin. Anger is properly named for a passion. A passion of the sensitive appetite is good insofar as it is regulated by reason, whereas if it is evil if it is set the order of reason aside. Now, the order of reason in regard to anger may be considered in relation to two things. First, in relation to the appetible object of which anger tends, and that is revenge. And let me kind of summarize this, and you can go back and read it if you'd like. Thomas is saying that when somebody is justified to anger, then it's actually not sinful, right? If somebody comes in and attacks your family, you should be angry. You should have a righteous anger about that. But if it becomes inordinate, and you're doing crazy things, or setting buildings on fire, or running around with a baseball bat hitting people, I mean, then it becomes a sin. But anger in itself can sometimes be justified and is not always angry. It is, of course, one of the deadly sins, but that would be inordinate anger, right? Humility, is it the greatest of virtues? When you think of humility, sometimes people think of Saint Mother Teresa. If you are humble, nothing will touch you, neither praise nor disgrace, because you know what you are. Interesting that she said what you are, not who you are. That's interesting. The good of human virtue pertains to the order of reason, which order is considered chiefly in reference to the end, wherefore the theological virtues are the greatest because they have the last end for their object, God. Secondarily, however, it is considered in reference to the ordering of the means to the end. This ordinance, as to its essence, is in the reason itself from which it issues, but by participation it is in the appetite ordered by the reason, and this ordinance is the effect of justice, especially of legal justice. Now, humility makes a man a good subject to the ordinance of all kinds and in all matters, while every other virtue has this effect in some special matter. Therefore, after the theological virtues, after the intellectual virtues with regard to reason itself, and after justice, especially legal justice, humility stands before all others. Okay, so Thomas is ordering them. Theological virtues first, intellectual virtues, which would be like wisdom and science um, and also prudence would be an intellectual virtue and a cardinal virtue as well, and then justice, and then humility. All right. Okay, pride, is it a mortal sin? Okay, no one likes the proud guy. We have whole organizations named after the pride. Okay, so we know that this is a buzzword in the culture today, and Thomas is saying pride is opposed to humility. Now, humility properly regards the subjection of man to God. Hence, pride properly regards lack of this subjection insofar as a man raises himself above that which is appointed to him, where according to the divine rule or measure. Wherefore it is written, the beginning of the pride of the man is to fall off from God, because to wit, the root of pride is found to consist in man not being in some way subject to God as his rule. Now it is evident that not to be subject to God is of its very nature a mortal sin, for this consists in turning away from God, and consequently pride is of its genus a mortal sin. Now, pride can be good in the sense like I'm proud of my children or I'm proud of my spouse, but when we don't have it ordered, just like, remember, pusillanimity and presumption, it was a lack of order, a lack of understanding our nature. Okay, nature, so important. Okay, the final one. I know this has been a long one. Whether the first man's pride consisted in his coveting God's likeness. All right, so first man's pride meaning Adam and Eve, and Thomas makes this distinction. While both the devil and the first man coveted God's likeness inordinately, neither of them sinned by coveting a likeness of nature. But the first man sinned chiefly by coveting God's likeness in regard knowledge of good and evil, according to the serpent's instigation, namely that by his own natural power he might decide what was good and what was evil for him to do, or again, that he should of himself foreknow what good and what evil would befall him. Secondarily, he sinned by coveting God's likeness as regards his own power of operation, namely that by his own natural power he might act so as to obtain happiness. On the other hand, the devil sinned by coveting God's likeness as regards power, wherefore Augustine says that he wished to enjoy his own power rather than God's. Nevertheless, both coveted something to be equal to God, insofar as each wished to rely on himself in contempt of the order of divine rule. Okay, so how many times do we have to explain this? That the key here to understand is that we have to understand who we are. We have to have a human anthropology, understand our nature, what we can do, what we can't do, where we stand in regard to animals and angels and God, right, and the Blessed Mother and the saints, and what does our nature allow us to do, what does it not? And when we go overboard, we sin. When we go too low, like we drink too much and we take away the very capacity of reason, we sin there as well. We got to be in the middle. We got to understand human nature. All right, that's it. I know this has been a long one. Let me know if you watched the whole thing. I know time is very valuable, but this is good information. This is practical information, and I do appreciate you watching, and we will have several videos on the Cardinal Virtue of Justice coming up next as we journey through the Summa. Thanks for watching. God bless you.